With projects in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Africa and Latin America, we take a look at the impact of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. China's signature foreign policy outreach project, the Belt and Road Initiative, aims to connect the world and facilitate global trade. The World Bank estimates that by 2030, these infrastructure developments and investments could lift 7.6 million people out of extreme poverty. Chinese President Xi Jinping has urged more efforts to promote high-quality cooperation. He made the remarks at a symposium this month on the development of the Belt and Road Initiative. Wang Haiyang reports.
President Xi acknowledged the achievements of the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, since its inception in 2013. He also highlighted the need to properly manage risks and challenges amid rising unilateralism, protectionism, and regional instability. Xi said the BRI has entered a phase of high-quality development. At the third Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation in 2023, Xi announced 8 major steps that China will take to advance Belt and Road cooperation. At the symposium, Xi said China needs to follow the 8 steps to enhance interconnectivity. That includes connectivity in infrastructure, institutional rules and standards, and people-to-people exchanges. He also said China will coordinate its efforts in signature projects, small yet smart people-centered programs, and in traditional and emerging areas to make the BRI more resilient and sustainable. President Xi called for more efforts to refine the operational mechanisms of the BRI, including improved planning and management frameworks, enhanced coordination of connectivity, and strengthened cooperation in supply chains and emerging industries. He also called for better mechanisms in international collaboration, diversified financing, risk management, and the protection of overseas interests. As development depends on long-term commitment, Xi encouraged sustained efforts to contribute to the advancement of Belt and Road cooperation.
It's time to bring in our guests. From London, Ryder is the CEO of Development Reimagined. From Santiago, Jorge Heine is a former Chilean ambassador to China and a research professor at Boston University. Anthony Moretti is an associate professor at Robert Morris University. He joins us from Pittsburgh. And from Beijing, Einar Tangen is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. Welcome to all of you. Einar, Chinese President Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. And if we look at its achievements over the past 11 years since that time, it's been pretty impressive. As I said, the goal is to connect the world, facilitate trade by developing infrastructure. When you look over the past year, what do you see as the project's main achievements, and what are we going to see next year?
Well, quite frankly, if you start looking and measuring what has happened in those 10 years, I would say that the Belt and Road Initiative has been the single largest contributor to the fact that the developing world is actually outpacing the developed world in terms of development, GDP growth, etc. In terms of what has happened, you know, we saw what happened in Peru with the Chanque port and what that means. But if you start looking broadly at all the pieces that have been put together, it forms a broad network of ports, roads, highways that connect countries. But what is needed, and is what is going to be happening in the future, I believe, is more project-based. It's going to be filling in. It's like sketching the outlines of something that you think you want to create, and then filling in the colors and making it work into a complete picture.
Ryder, let's look at Africa. This is a continent which has got enormous potential. There's a great deal of excitement when people talk about development in Africa. It is key, of course, to the Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, almost all countries on the continent have joined in the initiative. Now, you were recently in Nigeria and met with Joseph Tegbe, who is the Director General and Global Liaison for the Nigeria-China Strategic Partnership. Can you give us a sense of how important this project is for Africa?
Well, certainly as you've already mentioned, 52 African countries are already signed members of the BRI, and the African Union also has a MOU with the Chinese government on the BRI, so that it means that this is a project which is very important. There are a number of projects in different countries across the continent where Belt and Road Initiative has been kind of the way of driving infrastructure development. You mentioned Nigeria, where I was recently. There are so many different projects, whether it's port development, special economic zones. There are also a number of railway projects, even within cities like Lagos, that have been linked to the Belt and Road Initiative and the openness of China to be able to provide what one can call patient capital for these sorts of large infrastructure projects. My own country, Kenya, we're an African-led, African-owned consultancy in China. We had the Standard Gauge Railway as one of the major flagship projects under Belt and Road Initiative, and I think there's still extremely strong appetite for more of these such projects. We saw that during the last Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, where we had, again, over 50 African heads of state and government join that, really saying, we want more from China, we want to see more infrastructure. And remember, of course, Africa has almost 4 times the size of land that China has. So it's not a simple activity to really build infrastructure on the continent, but it's absolutely critical.
Ambassador Jorge Heine, the Belt and Road Initiative is also in Latin America. This is a continent which also needs a great deal of infrastructure as it grows, as it develops. Our correspondent, Jim Spellman, he looked at recent developments in the region and sent us this report. Let's listen.
In Lima, Peru, Chinese President Xi Jinping attended a meeting of the APEC leaders and promoted interconnectivity, free trade, sustainable development, and high-tech innovation.
The world is continuously seeing new uncertainty, and there's quite a bit of protectionist challenges that are, out there. And so I think President Xi's speech spoke quite correctly to working to try to break down those barriers, creating more open economies, and advocating free trade in the Asia-Pacific region.
The Chinese president also took part via video link in the opening of the new Chiangkai megaport. The new $1.3 billion facility, some 80 kilometers north of Lima, was built through China's Belt and Road Initiative and is the biggest deep-water Pacific port in South America. It's expected to cut shipping times to China, boost trade between Latin America and Asia, and create thousands of jobs in Peru each year.
President Xi Jinping's trip to Latin America is of great significance, beginning with the opening of the Chiangkai port, deepening trust between China and Latin America, and marking a new chapter in China-Latin America relations.
The
Chinese president is calling for solidarity among developing economies to find win-win cooperation mechanisms, to seek a common backing to gain greater political power in negotiations, to speak with a common voice in front of the developed economies, and overcome the high fences that impede our progress.
Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
So, Ambassador, looking over the past year, what is your assessment of how the BRI has performed in Latin America and how it's made those contributions to sustainable development?
Well, I will say this. There is no doubt that the inauguration of the Chiangkai port in Peru is sort of the major highlight of the BRI in Latin America, and we've heard the numbers, what it implies, how it will cut down travel time for cargo from South America to Asia by 10 days, which is an extraordinary amount these days. So that is very significant. But aside from that, I would emphasize that the major point to underscore about the BRI in Latin America in this past year has been the transition from the BRI as it originally started to what has been called the Green BRI. That is, a commitment not just to major physical infrastructure projects, but also the commitment to e-mobility, to fintech, to cloud computing, to digital connectivity, all these things that make 21st century societies work. In that sense, the complementarity between South America's deposits of copper and lithium that are so important for e-mobility, and the industrial capacity of China in that particular area of green technology are extraordinary. And it seems to me that shows very much the way forward. We've seen announcements of major factories by Chinese companies, WebID, Great Wall in Brazil. I hope we see more of that in South America, and that is very much the wave of the future. So I think the headline for the BRI in Latin America in 2024 is really the green BRI.
Anthony Moretti, most countries in the BRI are developing nations. There are a few in Europe, of course, but most are in the global south. China has a very different approach to its trade and economic relationship and, of course, its aid relationship with these countries from the United States and other Western countries, doesn't it?
It really does. You know, if you want to use the analogy of a velvet glove versus an iron fist, you know, too often Washington came in with a sense of this is what you're going to do. No conversation. It's largely going to be rules that we wrote and rules that we will find benefit from. Where China is coming in instead, and you see this in Africa, you see this in Latin America, you see this in Europe, with a message that says, look, let's look at this as a partnership. Let's find a way where, let's find what you need, and let's make sure that those goals get met, and let's find what we need, and let's find how those goals can get met. And at the same time, let's find out what we each can bring in terms of resources, personnel, knowledge, etc., so that this doesn't look like I own this, but instead it looks like we own this. And that pronoun and that sense of collective ownership is certainly a message that is resonating well. And I think one of the reasons that Washington is so frustrated by it, because again, what you're seeing is countries, especially in the developing world, saying, yes, this is a philosophy that we can also benefit and win from.
Einar, how would you characterize the Chinese view of investments in the developing world compared to that with those Western countries that we talked about?
Well, I'd agree with Anthony in terms of saying that this is collaborative, it's cooperative. But the major difference that you see here is that China is willing to share IP. Europe, the United States, it is about developing IP and then basically rent-seeking, getting the highest possible profit for as long as possible. But with China, they're developing research and development centers, they're expanding their university cooperations, and we've seen this in real terms during COVID. China was the one who said, look, we're going to start putting factories and sharing our technology, not only for this particular pandemic, but for future ones. And this is a major difference. And as I said earlier, it's part of this kind of coloring in. When it first started, the Belt and Road Initiative was very much government to government. But the only thing you can be assured of when it's government to government is when there's a new government, they're going to say that it was a bad deal. So you see the Belt and Road switching to project. They look at the feasibility. They try to, as much as possible, stay away from the government to government things. There are obviously some projects that, stadiums, civil improvements, things like this that are necessary. But this has led to a much more stable situation because you can look at the revenues from these projects to make sure that they get paid back.
Hannah, there is a strategic element to these relationships that we are talking about. Do you think that some countries in the developing world are put in this very invidious position where they have to take sides, decide who's going to be, which alliance they're going to be?
Well, I think we have to remember that every country has to think about their own national interest, and however China's framed or however other countries are framed, even working with the global South also meets China's national interests. That's not, we have to remember that. But at the same time, I think what we are also having increasingly of, again, going back to, you mentioned visiting Nigeria and speaking to the new special envoy on China. Look, they're thinking, look, what do we want out of our relationship? How do we make sure that when we are working with China on Belt and Road Initiative or, on greening and all these sorts of issues, how do we make sure we're also meeting our national interest? And I think, and I think that their point is also that it doesn't mean choosing sides. It means that you are working with different countries on different issues. You don't need to say the US might not be the best partner in infrastructure. In many cases, it absolutely isn't. But in other areas, there may be some very useful, like say for example, fintech. The US obviously has a lead in that area. So it's possible to work with different partners for different outcomes. But the main thing is to have your country and your region as the center point.
Ambassador Heine, there are some major countries in the global south that are not members of the BRI. Take Brazil, for example, and you wrote a piece recently talking about the fact that Brazil, the largest economy in Latin America, didn't join the Belt and Road Initiative, yet it's an important trading partner with China. China is involved in infrastructure projects in Brazil, and you say it's not that important that it's not a member of BRI. Just explain that to us.
Much was made of the fact that Brazil has not signed on to the BRI. And my argument is that Brazil obviously has to calibrate its foreign policy. Brazil is right now a real diplomatic hub. It chaired the G20 this year. Coming year will chair the BRICS group, will chair COP30. So it is really a very significant player. It therefore has to balance many things. And in that context, whether it signs on or not to the BRI, it seems to me is somewhat secondary to the very deep links that already exist anyway between Brazil and China, expressed in mutual visits, President Lula, President Xi, and the many projects that they have got going. The fact that President Xi and President Lula signed 37 agreements in the recent visit to Rio by President Xi speaks for itself. So in that sense, it seems to me, it's important to put that in perspective. Brazil has to balance many priorities. It's a very fraught international moment. And in that sense, it is perfectly understandable that it has not signed on to the BRI at this moment.
Heine, I want to get back to something that Ambassador Heine talked about a moment ago, and that is, if we look at the countries of Africa, or we look at the developing world in general, it's not just physical infrastructure that it needs, it also needs digital infrastructure. I mean, we're moving rapidly into digital economies right now. We need systems to share information, to advance and facilitate trading as well. These countries are at risk of falling victim to what's known as the digital divide, or the digital gap, as it's sometimes called. They could fall behind. How important is the BRI in terms of promoting this kind of development?
Well, I think because of its emphasis on connectivity, now we can't forget that physical infrastructure is very important in the African continent, way behind the rest of the world. Just 4% of the world's infrastructure is on the African continent. Yet, as I mentioned, it's over almost 4 times the size of China, 4 times the size of the US. So, we must remember that that's fundamental. But nevertheless, digital is very important. And of course, you still need some degree of physical infrastructure like data centers and so on, cables for digital connectivity. But it is a lot cheaper than other types of infrastructure. And we've seen, for example, on the African continent, we've got close to 85% of Africans do have access to 3G, really because we've had to leapfrog. We moved away from depending on land-based telephony systems and managed to get to 3G. However, China now has around 45% of the continent of the population at around having access to 5G. That's the kind of thing that African countries would also be aiming for. And so, but at the moment only have around 3%. So these are the kinds of shifts that the Belt and Road Initiative, through a focus on digital connectivity, can try to shift. And that kind of shift can happen within a few years. It's plausible with digital connectivity, and therefore can be really helpful. It can also, as the ambassador was mentioning, it can also drive improvements in things like e-commerce and trade, so that that also moves more smoothly, also smart mobility and all these sorts of things. So there are also spillover effects to improving digital connectivity, which will help stimulate growth.
Actually, Heine, In some respects, Africa is ahead of many other parts of the world when it comes to the use of digital technology. I mean, you take a country like Kenya, for instance, which has been using digital transactions for a long time.
Yes, we started earlier, even before China. And again, you know, this is the kind of, this is the point that the Global South has a lot to teach the rest of the world. It's not just a one-way system, but nevertheless, we can also, if we're not careful, we can also fall behind. So you take an example like Kenya's M-Pesa, which started back in 2007. There's a lot more upgrading that needs to be done to that. And again, that's something that we can do with Chinese companies, we can do with Chinese support, and we can also still do ourselves. So it's a mix, and I think different partners can be helpful in progressing, but also remembering that we have a lot to offer ourselves.
Anthony Moretti, you know, so much of what the BRI does is integrated with other global challenges, like the battle against climate change, for instance. I mean, China has taken the lead in the development of green technology. So how is China helping promote this kind of technology in the developing world? I mean, things like moving to other sources of energy rather than fossil fuels.
I think what you're seeing is a message that is both simple and complex. And what I mean by simple is, number one, this is the future. This is good for the environment. This is going to be good for generations to come. This is going to be good for the current generation. But there also is the complexity involved in that, meaning that you've got to make sure the resources are there. You've got to make sure the personnel are there. You've got to make sure that the technology is in place. And, you know, I want to go back to something that Einar mentioned a couple of minutes ago, this idea of gathering experts together so that China can become a hub also for educational opportunities. So there was a announcement back in November, I believe it was, during a international conference in China. And one of the points that was made was, look, we want to bring together people from the developing world who can come to China, who can learn right now in terms of what we'll call cutting edge technologies, and learn about how they're being used, how they're being applied. And again, this idea being that we're not going to force this upon you, but we see an opportunity for all sides to gain success and to see cooperation, certainly as a way to ensure all countries, whether or two countries, if it's just a bilateral conversation, will benefit from what's being said and what's being done.
Important point you mentioned there, Anthony, and that is, you know, the fact that there are people traveling to China, the people from China traveling to the rest of the world as well. You know, China places a great deal of emphasis on people-to-people exchanges. I mean, that's also important in terms of cultural exchanges, isn't it?
No question about it, you know, and coming from the educational world as I do, one thing that, you know, I'm very keen on seeing is where are those opportunities for whether the students and faculty are coming from the West, from the Global South, from wherever, where are those opportunities for them to go to China, likewise for Chinese scholars and educators to travel to other parts of the world. The bottom line is the more ideas that are shared, the more expertise that is provided, whether it's scholar to scholar or whether students are involved. Again, current generation benefits, but the next generation benefits as well. And let's face it, that next generation is one that is going to face perhaps complex problems that our generation can only imagine or perhaps only fears.
Ambassador Heine, you've also talked about the importance of cultural exchanges, people-to-people exchanges. China recently announced that it will remove visa requirements for travelers from 54 countries. These are for short stays in China, up to 10 days. And of course, it also includes a lot of travelers from Latin America. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a very important step. I understand in those 54 countries, I included Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, and my own country, Chile. I am very happy about that. It will certainly facilitate tourism, other visits. And I also hope that the number of countries from Latin America will be expanded in the future and that the number of days will be extended as well. For somebody coming from as far as the Southern Cone, 10 days in China may not be enough. But it is a very important step in the right direction. I'm very encouraged by that. There is a great fascination with Chinese history, culture, Chinese civilization in my part of the world. People want to see it. People want to get to know it. and everything that facilitates that, like removing the hassle of visas, is very much a step in the right direction.
Einar, of course, the BRI has its critics, and there are critics in the West who see this initiative as what they sometimes call debt trap diplomacy. That has been debunked. In fact, there was a think tank in the United Kingdom, Chatham House, which published a paper that debunked that. What are your views on that?
Well, you know, for the last 600 years, people have gotten used to this idea of empire thinking, colonialization, that you take things from others in order to make yourself rich. It's quite different from civilizational thinking, which is about how do you manage what is there. You don't take things from other people because that causes problems. Civilizations understand that. So there, unfortunately, is a tendency to impugn one's own intentions on others. You know, if I'm a thief, I think everyone else is a thief, and I'm just, you know, doing what everyone else does before they do. And this is part of the problem. China doesn't make countries choose. It doesn't say to Brazil, if you don't join the BRI, you're going to be on our menu. This is not the way it works, and the world has to adjust to that. Right now, everything in the West, especially in the United States, which is trying to maintain hegemony, they assume that that's exactly what China's trying to do. They're going to have to adjust their thinking, as is most of the world, to start thinking that, you know, we live in a collaborative environment which is multilateral, multipolar.
Hannah, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, what do you hear from leaders in the developing world when there are these criticisms of debt trap diplomacy? I mean, one of the things we should remember that most of the money that's owed by developing countries is actually owed to Western banks.
Well, I think the hardest part about the idea of debt trap diplomacy is this idea that governments are somehow not responsible enough to think about their debt situations and manage their debt situations, and also the idea that they may somehow be corrupted or whatever. These are specific pictures of developing country governments and that are painted, but are not true. There are, you know, many governments actually keep well below certain debt sustainability thresholds, so that they can avoid any major challenges with managing debt. In addition, we have to remember that countries are raising debt, are borrowing money in order to quite often, as we've talked about with many of the Belt and Road Initiative projects, really try to fund infrastructure, to fund projects that have been denied for many, many years, that they've been and have finally found partners or even private sector partners who think a bit differently and a bit more openly about these projects. So I think it tends to be a very sort of condescending view, and most governments, when they do get this question put to them, are ready to just say this is absolute nonsense.
And that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arlen Ryder in Washington, D.C.